Ella Moore, in this memorial marriage ceremony, assumed the role of interim proxy holder in accordance with Adrian Hawthorne's urgent will. The ring, Miss Moore. Miss Moore?
There's someone. There's someone out there.
There's no one there. We need to continue. It's time to sign. Sign it, Ella. "48 hours before the ghostly ceremony, the heavy, suffocating silence of hospital room 317 was broken only by the steady, rhythmic dripping of the intravenous fluid. The sharp, sterile smell of bleach and isopropyl alcohol hung heavy in the air, mixing with the bittersweet fragrance of 3 pale, rescued lilies sitting on a chipped plastic bedside table. Oliver lay perfectly still against the starch-white hospital sheets, his collarbones casting deep, skeletal shadows beneath his thin paper gown. Despite the dark bluish circles bruising his young eyes, he managed to offer a weak, teasing smile as he looked at her. "Did you bring me more of those beautiful rejected flowers from the shop downstairs?" Oliver asked, his voice coming out in a quiet, fragile rasp. Ella sat closely beside him, her fingers gently brushing the cold, damp hair from his forehead with deep tenderness. She forced her lips into a reassuring smile, desperately trying to hide the paper notice from the billing department that was burning a hole in her faded apron pocket. "They are never rejected, Oliver. Only terribly underrated," Ella replied softly, her voice trembling slightly as she squeezed his thin hand. The hospital administration had already made it clear that if a substantial deposit was not paid by Friday, they would be forced to halt Oliver's dialysis and transition him to basic palliative care. This was a polite, clinical way of telling her that her brother would be left to die in that cold room. Oliver turned his face slowly toward the rain-streaked window, his breathing shallow and rattling as the fluorescent light overhead flickered with a quiet, annoying buzz. His voice sounded incredibly heavy, carrying the grim, quiet wisdom of a boy who knew his young body was running out of borrowed time. "Promise me, Ella, do not let them buy you," Oliver whispered, his weak fingers wrapping tightly around her wrist. "Do not let the wealthy buy your soul, no matter how desperate we become." Ella lowered her gaze to the scuffed linoleum floor, unable to voice a promise she knew she might have to break. Poverty had a cruel way of redefining a person's moral boundaries, and she was already standing at the edge. Later that afternoon, a cold chill swept through the hospital corridors when a tall, clean-cut man in an expensive tailored suit began loitering near Oliver's room. He claimed to be a representative from an insurance agency, but his sharp, calculating eyes and the way he questioned the nurses suggested a far more sinister motive. Ella watched him from the shadows of the hallway, her heart tightening with an instinctive dread, as she realized that the predators of New York were already circling her brother's fragile life. She retreated to the safety of the hospital's tiny, damp flower shop, the sharp, metallic snip of her gardening shears echoing against the glass walls. The warm, humid air in the room suddenly grew incredibly heavy and perfectly still as the glass door chimed, and Margaret Hawthorne stepped through the threshold. She was dressed in a flawless, pristine navy silk suit, her silver-capped cane tapping against the tiled floor with a slow, terrifying rhythm of absolute authority. "I know you need $47,000 to save your brother, Miss Moore," Margaret stated flatly, her cold eyes staring directly into Ella's tired face. The heavy iron shears in Ella's hand stopped moving mid-cut, hovering frozen over a white rose. The wealthy matriarch calmly opened her leather handbag, offering to deposit $100,000 into Oliver's medical account before the sun went down. "I do not sell my body, Mrs. Hawthorne, nor do I sign any papers that I have not thoroughly vetted first," Ella replied slowly, setting her shears down on the wooden counter. A faint, chilling smile touched Margaret's withered lips, her dark eyes gleaming with a strange sense of satisfaction. "Good. I need exactly the kind of girl who reads the fine prints before signing her life away," Margaret whispered, her gravelly voice echoing in the small shop. Margaret then revealed her bizarre, unsettling demand, explaining that she needed Ella to act as a bride in a private memorial betrothal ceremony for her grandson, Adrian. He had tragically perished in a violent, fiery car crash 6 months prior, leaving the family in a brutal war over his vast inheritance. Ella felt a wave of confusion wash over her, her mind struggling to comprehend why a multi-billion-dollar dynasty would want a poor flower girl to engage in a ceremony with a dead man. Margaret leaned closer, her expensive perfume of vintage jasmine and cold rain filling the space between them, as she explained the legal deception. This memorial betrothal was not a religious ritual, but a clever exploitation of a highly specific clause in the Hawthorne family trust. Under this clause, if Adrian was formally engaged to an independent party at the time of a shareholder deadlock, his temporary proxy voting rights would be released to his chosen partner to protect the company. By taking part in this legal charade, Ella would become the sole shield preventing Margaret's power-hungry nephew Lucas from seizing total control of the corporation. Ella fit all of Margaret's ruthless criteria. She was a complete outsider to the corporate world, held no financial ties to Lucas, and was desperate enough for money to play the part. "Adrian actually knew you, Miss Moore. He remembered you as the brave, nameless girl who saved him from a brutal parking lot attack months ago," Margaret revealed just before turning to leave. Ella stood frozen behind the wooden counter, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to connect a chaotic, half-forgotten memory with the cold face of a dead billionaire. Realizing this dangerous charade was the only path to keeping her brother alive, she agreed to read the contract, knowingly stepping into a dark maze of corporate lies. As she walked out of the back room later that evening, Ella noticed the same tall man in the long gray coat she had seen earlier, now standing near the vending machines at the end of the corridor. He was not looking at any patients, but was instead studying the blinking red lights of the security cameras, calculating their blind spots with chilling precision. When Ella took a cautious step forward, the mysterious man turned sharply, his face obscured by a low cap, and vanished silently into the concrete emergency stairwell. A deep, freezing chill crept up her arms, signaling to her soul that she was already a marked target in a game she did not understand. Late that night, under the harsh yellow glow of a buzzing desk lamp, Ella sat on her small mattress and read the heavy legal contract for the third time. While the first several pages seemed like standard corporate jargon, the hidden terms on the second page contained a terrifying trap designed to strip away her freedom. Clause 9.1 explicitly stated that Ella could not make any legal, financial, or medical decisions for the next 6 months without the written consent of the Hawthorne board. She realized with horror that if she signed this, Lucas could easily block her from authorizing Oliver's emergency procedures or daily care. A hot, defiant fury ignited in her chest, pushing away her fear. She grabbed a thick black pen and aggressively crossed out the entire paragraph, the metal nib tearing slightly into the expensive, heavy paper. In the margins, she wrote a fierce, handwritten refusal, stating that she would never surrender her right to protect her family's medical decisions. Oliver stirred in his sleep to the sound of her furious scratching, looking up with tired, bloodshot eyes. "Are you doing something foolish in the dark, Ella?" Oliver asked, his voice rough and raspy from the dry hospital air. Ella quickly crawled onto his bed, whispering gently to soothe his fears as she brushed his hair back. "They might rent my name for a little while, but I will never allow them to own my soul," Ella promised, her voice filled with unbreakable strength. At dawn, she couriered the heavily edited contract back to the sprawling Hawthorne estate. Within 3 hours, Margaret called her private phone, her voice carrying a dry, dark amusement. "I accept your changes, Miss Moore. You are far more observant than my nephew anticipated," Margaret stated before hanging up the phone without another word. Ella held the silent device, her hand trembling, as she realized that Lucas and Vivian had likely slipped that clause in, desperately hoping she would sign the contract blindly. The next evening, following the hollow, ghostly ceremony in the private Gothic chapel, the true weight of her new prison began to crush her. Vivian Hawthorne. Adrian's icy and elegant stepmother led Ella away from the altar and down the endless echoing corridors of the historic mansion. The sharp, military clicking of Vivian's red-bottomed heels against the polished mahogany floorboards sounded like a ticking countdown, contrasting sharply with Ella's soft, silent steps. They paused briefly in front of an old, dust-coated family portrait, displaying Adrian's biological parents, a painting that Vivian was noticeably absent from.
"Dead women are always the easiest ones to worship, aren't they?" Vivian muttered in a venomous whisper, her perfectly manicured fingers adjusting the gold frame. Turning her emotionless porcelain face back to Ella, Vivian rapidly laid down the absolute unyielding rules of the Hawthorne estate. She decreed that Ella's existence was now confined to her room at the end of the hall, and that she was to never wander the grounds after 9 at night.
"And what is hidden behind the locked doors of the East Wing, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Ella asked, gathering her courage to look directly at the older woman. Vivian stepped closer, her expression tightening into a mask of pure threat. "The East Wing is the only territory Margaret still pretends to control. Stepping foot inside will result in your immediate ruin," Vivian warned sharply before turning and sweeping down the hall. As Vivian walked away, Ella noticed that the heavy brass lock on the East Wing door was covered in tiny, frantic scratch marks, as if someone had desperately tried to claw their way inside.
To make matters worse, Ella soon discovered that the mansion's head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was constantly hovering near her room, checking her trash and asking invasive questions. It was obvious that Mrs. Gable was on Lucas's payroll, serving as a spy to ensure the new bride did not uncover the secrets of the house. Furthermore, during her very first dinner at the estate, Lucas cornered her in the massive dining room, sliding a check for $1 million across the table.
"Take this check, Ella. Disappear forever, because playing Margaret's game will only lead to your utter destruction."
Lucas whispered his voice, smooth and deceptively friendly as he leaned in. Ella looked at the life-changing amount of money, then looked directly into Lucas's predatory eyes, and slowly pushed the check back to him.
"Some things are far too expensive to be bought with a piece of paper, Mr. Hawthorne," Ella replied calmly, proving to him that she was a force he could not easily control. From the deep shadows at the far end of the dim hallway, Lucas watched her leave the orange ember of his expensive cigar illuminating the intense, dangerous frustration in his eyes. Later that evening, Clara Bennett, Adrian's former fiancée, cornered Ella inside the small firelit parlor. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across Clara's trembling hands as she poured 2 cups of black tea. Her usual snobbish arrogance seemed to crack under the weight of an intense, silent terror that she was desperately trying to hide. "That car crash was not an accident, Ella. It was a desperate move by Lucas to silence Adrian forever before the truth could be revealed to the board," Clara whispered, her voice shaking as she leaned across the table. Suddenly, the heavy, hollow thud of Mrs. Gable's footsteps echoed from the wooden hallway directly outside the parlor doors. Clara stopped speaking instantly, her jaw freezing as every drop of color drained from her face, her eyes wide with a raw, primal panic. Ella watched her with intense focus, realizing in that quiet moment that Clara was not just a bitter, jealous rival. Clara was deeply, profoundly terrified of Lucas, and her warning to Ella was born out of survival, not malice. The next morning, the grand, sunlit dining room felt less like a place of comfort and more like an interrogation chamber. Lucas slid a thin, innocent-looking document across the massive mahogany table, demanding her signature to finalize her corporate proxy role. "I will not sign a single page without reading every word first, Mr. Hawthorne." Ella refused, pushing the paper back across the table with her eyes matching his cold gaze. Vivian did not look up, her expression entirely empty, as she slowly dragged her silver fork across the porcelain plate, creating a high-pitched metallic screech that filled the silent room. The deliberate, agonizing noise was a silent threat, a physical demonstration of the suffocating pressure they intended to place on the girl. "You should remember your place, Miss Moore. Everything in the Hawthorne family runs on absolute mutual trust." Vivian sneered from her seat, her voice dripping with condescension. Ella met her icy gaze without flinching, her expression entirely unbothered. "I have learned that in the real world, Mrs. Hawthorne, everything of value runs on ironclad contracts, not trust," Ella retorted, her sharp reply silencing the table. Lucas and Vivian exchanged a rapid, silent glance of deep concern, realizing this poor flower girl was not the easily manipulated pawn they had expected. Seeking a moment of escape, Ella spent the afternoon walking through the estate's sprawling, manicured gardens, her mind carefully mapping out the locations of security cameras and blind spots. She eventually found Margaret sitting alone inside the massive glass greenhouse, surrounded by hundreds of rare, blooming white orchids. "The East Wing security cameras will be completely disabled for maintenance over the next 2 nights," Margaret remarked softly, not looking up from her book. It was not a casual observation. It was a deliberate, silent invitation for Ella to break the rules and find the hidden truth herself. That night, moving like a ghost through the silent corridors, Ella crossed paths with Rose, the elderly laundry-maid. Rose pushed her heavy wicker cart past Ella, keeping her head down to avoid the cameras, but subtly sliding a heavy brass key beneath a folded stack of clean towels. Ella unlocked the heavy door to Adrian's forbidden study with a racing heart, slipping inside the cold room which smelled of old parchment and sandalwood cologne. On the massive mahogany desk, she found a dried white lily preserved carefully inside a thick financial ledger, right next to a printed security photo of her working at the hospital flower shop. She quickly booted up the dusty laptop left on the desk, and a hidden video file began to play on the screen. "If you are watching this, it means I did not make it back in time. Lucas is funneling massive amounts of corporate cash through fake contractor accounts." Adrian's digital voice warned, his dark eyes staring directly into the camera. He stated that the original proof of the financial fraud and his altered dental records were hidden inside the green safe behind the portrait. "And if the person watching this is the girl from the hospital, I am sorry for dragging you into a corporate war that could cost you everything." Adrian apologized, his digital gaze filled with pain and sincerity. Just as the screen went black, a loud click echoed from the hallway, followed by the metallic rattle of keys. Mrs. Gable was unlocking the study door. With no time to run, Ella sprinted to the window, climbed over the cold balcony railing, and stepped onto a narrow concrete ledge under the freezing rain. She pressed her back flat against the brick wall, holding her breath as Mrs. Gable entered the room and swept her flashlight beam across the glass just inches from Ella's trembling fingers. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Gable locked the door and left, allowing Ella to climb back inside, shivering and clutching the stolen memory card. Ella barely made it back to her assigned bedroom before the smell of torn fabric and upturned drawers hit her. Her mattress had been violently flipped, her cheap clothes were ripped and scattered across the floor, and her cherished photo of Oliver lay shattered on the rug. As she stood shivering in the center of the ruined room, her phone buzzed with an urgent email from the hospital's billing office. An anonymous donor had just deposited $50,000 into Oliver's medical account, fully securing his medication for the next 10 days. Ella ran to her shattered window, looking down through the rain to see a black, unmarked sedan idling in the shadows of the street below. Standing beside the vehicle was the man in the gray coat, his face obscured by his hood, as he kept his eyes locked on her window, serving as her silent guardian. She realized with sudden clarity that while someone inside this mansion wanted to destroy her, someone outside was risking their life to keep her safe. The next day, Lucas tried a different, more public method of intimidation, forcing Ella to attend a private dinner with the board's most influential shareholders. During the dinner, he introduced her as a charity case, laughing about her background as a hospital flower girl in front of New York's elite.
Just like these dying centerpieces on the table, a corporation will rot from the inside if those in charge are too blind to notice the decay, Ella remarked softly, leaving the shareholders in a stunned, silent admiration. The air inside the grand parlor the following afternoon was so heavy, it felt difficult to breathe. The silence only broken by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Lucas stood perfectly still in the center of the room, flanked by two towering, broad-shouldered security guards, whose shadows stretched long and menacing across the thick Persian rug. He placed a thick leather binder in front of Ella, his tone sharp and completely stripped of his usual politeness as he demanded her signature. Ella flipped through the heavy pages with slow, agonizing precision, her finger stopping on the hidden clause on page 12. This clause surrenders all my voting authority to you, Mr. Hawthorne. I will never sign this, Ella stated flatly, pushing the binder back across the table. Vivian stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom as she glared at the young girl.
Do not mistake our forced kindness for weakness, Miss Moore. You were brought to this house out of mercy, Vivian warned, her eyes flashing with anger. Ella stood her ground, her expression entirely unbothered as she looked back at them. I was brought here by a contract, Mrs. Hawthorne, and no contract requires me to blindly kneel to a tyrant, Ella retorted, her defiant response leaving Vivian speechless. Lucas's polite mask completely slipped, his eyes burning with fury as he waited for her to leave the room. The moment the door clicked shut, he hurled his heavy crystal glass directly into the fireplace, the violent sound of shattering glass echoing through the quiet halls. That evening, Ella visited Oliver, heavily escorted by Mrs. Gable and a silent Hawthorne driver who watched her every move through the rearview mirror. Inside the sterile, quiet hospital room, Oliver noticed the dark bruise of exhaustion on her face. Do not bow to these monsters just to save my life, Ella. Please stand tall and do not kneel, Oliver begged, his voice weak but his eyes burning with a fierce, quiet pride. His brave, quiet words shattered her defenses, bringing a single hot tear down her cheek. She squeezed his hand, promising him she would fight with everything she had, realizing that his love was not her vulnerability, but her ultimate weapon. To escape the driver's suffocating surveillance, Ella slipped through the hospital's chaotic emergency wing and escaped out the staff exit. Marcus was waiting near the shadows of the vending machines, offering a quick confirming nod before disappearing into the crowded street. Ella boarded a late-night city bus, watching the blur of neon lights wash over her reflection in the dirty window. She got off at 47th Street, her fingers tightly clutching a crumpled diner receipt Marcus had dropped earlier, which contained a handwritten meeting time. As Ella stepped off the bus, the New York sky opened up, pouring down a freezing, torrential rain that soaked through her thin jacket in seconds. She pulled her hood low, her eyes scanning the dark pavement as she hurried along the slick sidewalks of Manhattan.
Suddenly she noticed the reflection of headlights crawling slowly behind her.
A heavy black SUV was matching her pace, its tires splashing through the deep puddles. Her heart leaped into her throat as the passenger window rolled down, revealing the sharp, scanning eyes of one of Lucas's private security guards. Ella did not hesitate, turning sharply into a narrow, dimly lit alleyway and sprinting through the dark. Behind her, the loud slam of car doors and the heavy thud of running boots echoed against the brick walls. "Hey, stop her right now!" a guard shouted, his voice cutting fiercely through the sound of the pouring rain. She ran blindly through the maze of wet alleys, her wet clothes clinging to her skin and her boots slipping on the wet asphalt. She could hear their footsteps getting closer, their flashlight beams cutting through the rain and sweeping across the brick walls just behind her. She lunged down the subway stairs, her cold fingers searching her wet pockets until they brushed against a plastic transit card Rose had slipped under her towels earlier. She swiped the card with a desperate prayer, the metal turnstile clicking open, just as the heavy footsteps of her pursuers echoed from the stairs above. She blended into a thick group of passengers boarding an arriving train, slipping through the sliding doors just as they began to close. Through the glass, she saw Lucas's guards burst onto the platform, scanning the crowd in frustration as the train pulled away into the dark tunnel. After riding the train for 3 stops, she stepped back onto the wet pavement of Manhattan, using the prepaid emergency cab voucher Rose had attached to the card to hail a passing yellow taxi, finally slipping away from her hunters. The small, run-down diner smelled of burnt grease and buzzed under the flickering glow of red and blue neon signs. Ella walked quickly to the back corner booth, where Marcus and Attorney Thompson sat in the deep shadows. Marcus finally pulled back his hood, revealing a rugged, tired face as he looked at her. "The anonymous money for Oliver came directly from Adrian. He is alive, Ella." Marcus revealed quietly, his dark eyes locked on hers. Ella felt the air leave her lungs, her head spinning as she tried to process the impossible truth. Marcus explained how he had pulled Adrian's bloodied body from the burning wreckage of the car just seconds before the fuel tank exploded. Thompson quickly added that Adrian had been recovering in a secure private clinic, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "If Adrian appears too early, Lucas will instantly erase the company's main servers, destroying all evidence of his massive financial fraud," Thompson explained, his expression grave. They needed Ella to officially enter the independent audit request at Friday's meeting before Adrian could safely reveal himself. Ella learned with horror that the charred body found in the wrecked car belonged to an unidentified man stolen from the county morgue, and Lucas had paid Officer Raymond Doyle to falsify the dental records. Thompson handed Ella copies of the devastating evidence, instructing her to let Rose smuggle the original documents out of the house on Friday morning. To resolve the issue of hospital security, Thompson presented Ella with a formal emergency co-guardianship order, naming his respected legal firm as Oliver's co-guardian. Under strict New York medical privacy laws, this order legally blocked any hospital transfers or treatment changes without the joint signature of both Ella and Thompson's firm. This brilliant legal move completely neutralized Lucas's ability to manipulate Oliver's medical care, providing Ella with an ironclad shield. When Ella returned to the mansion late that night, she found Lucas waiting inside her dark bedroom like a wolf in the shadows.
Accidents happen to sick children in hospitals, Ella. You should sign the proxy papers by morning if you want to keep your brother safe,
Lucas warned, stepping into the moonlight with cold, threatening eyes. The very next morning, Lucas's terrifying threat materialized at St. Mark Hospital. 3 men dressed in fake medical scrubs entered Oliver's room, presenting a forged transfer order to move him to an undisclosed facility. Oliver tried weakly to fight them off, but they began aggressively wheeling his bed toward the exit. Suddenly, Marcus stepped into the doorway holding a live video feed with the hospital's chief of security and the attending physician. The doctor reviewed the emergency co-guardianship order on his screen, confirming the transfer papers were entirely forged and illegal. Security guards quickly arrived, forcing the three imposters to abandon the bed and flee down the emergency stairs.
Marcus immediately called Ella, his voice bringing a wave of relief over her phone. The transfer was blocked. The legal shield held Ella. Your brother is completely safe, Marcus reported, his tone filled with quiet triumph. With a shaking voice, Ella thanked him, realizing that the legal armor they had built was the only thing keeping Oliver alive. Under the cover of a pitch-black Thursday night, Ella crept back into Adrian's forbidden study in the East Wing. She carefully punched Margaret's birth date into the heavy green safe, the mechanical tumblers clicking open to reveal the family's darkest secrets. Inside, she finds the original forged dental records, the altered police reports, and a handwritten letter addressed directly to her. Adrian's written words detailed his profound regret for his grandmother's ruthless manipulation of her poverty. He instructed her to take only the copies, leave the originals for Rose, and to force Margaret to look directly at the innocent life she had gambled with. Ella followed his instructions perfectly, sealing the crucial evidence in a box for Rose to smuggle out in the morning. At daybreak, Ella confronted Margaret inside the damp, humid greenhouse. Pay for your sins publicly in the boardroom this afternoon, Mrs. Hawthorne. Do not hide behind your expensive orchids, Ella demanded, her voice cold as she stared down the wealthy matriarch. Margaret's regal posture faltered for a fraction of a second. Her voice strained as she admitted she had run out of choices. But Ella refused to offer forgiveness. Stepping out into the crisp morning air of the estate's back garden, Ella stood before the low wooden fence that led to freedom. She knew she could easily run away, take Oliver and leave the billionaires to destroy themselves. Taking a deep breath, she remembered Oliver's brave face, and she whispered to the wind that she would never kneel again. From the thick shadows of the ancient oak trees, a deep, familiar voice agreed with her. I am glad you said that before you saw me, Adrian Hawthorne remarked, quietly pulling down his black hood and stepping into the morning light. He was not a ghost. He was flesh and blood, his face bearing the faint, healing scars of a man who had crawled out of a fiery hell. Ella did not run to him or cry tears of relief. She simply stared at him, her intense anger warring with her exhaustion. I was wrong, Ella. I thought keeping you in the dark was a way of protecting you, but it was just another way of taking away your choice, Adrian admitted, his voice quiet and filled with genuine regret. He reached into his pocket and gently placed a faded, frayed white ribbon onto the wooden fence between them. It was the very ribbon Ella had used to tie her hair on the day she saved him in the parking lot 6 months ago. He confessed that even while trapped in that sterile clinic room, he had spent weeks watching her through the encrypted security feeds Marcus had hacked for him. He whispered that he had watched her face every night, admiring her quiet resilience and the way she refused to let his toxic family break her spirit. If you had come to me honestly 6 months ago, Adrian, I would have helped you. But at least it would have been my choice, Ella replied, her steady voice setting her boundaries. Adrian nodded quietly, accepting her words without defense, before instructing her to enter the audit request first, so he could safely seal the trap. By Friday afternoon, the atmosphere inside the Hawthorne mansion was suffocating and ready to explode. Lucas, running out of time, cornered Ella in the hallway, offering a final trade. Sign this proxy now, Ella, and you can leave this house with your pockets full. I will fund your brother's surgery immediately. Lucas offered, his tone desperate. Ella stared right through him, her voice ice-cold and filled with utter contempt. I will see you at the shareholder meeting this afternoon, Mr. Hawthorne, Ella replied, walking past him. Realizing he could not break her spirit, Lucas ordered Vivian to leak the private chapel wedding photo to the press, branding Ella as a shameless gold digger. Minutes later,
Clara aggressively dragged Ella into an abandoned dressing room, throwing a lavish black designer dress and pearls onto the table. "Put these on, Ella. Do not embarrass the family looking like a pathetic flower girl in front of the board," Clara sneered, her hands shaking with rage. Ella did not flinch, calmly looking at the trembling socialite.
Did you slap me because I am poor, Clara? Or because the truth hurts too much? Ella asked quietly, after Clara had struck her across the cheek with a resounding crack. At that exact moment, Clara's phone vibrated violently on the table with a text message from Lucas. The message was a blatant, chilling threat, warning Clara that if Ella talked, Lucas would frame Clara for the attempted murder. "Read it, Clara. He just turned his former fiancée into his disposable insurance policy," Ella stated, pointing at the glowing screen. Clara stopped breathing, her arrogant mask completely shattering to reveal a terrified, cornered woman as she stared at the screen. As Ella walked out of the room, Clara stared at her own trembling reflection in the mirror, wiped away her smudged red lipstick, and took a screenshot of Lucas's threat.
Back in her room, Ella packed her cheap bag, tying Oliver's red string bracelet firmly around her wrist. Margaret suddenly appeared at the doorway, handing her an unconditional, legally binding medical sponsorship for Oliver's surgery. Margaret admitted that the money was a debt owed to her, not a gift, regardless of what happened in the boardroom. Ella took the document without thanking her, handed back the heavy Hawthorne wedding ring, and walked out of the mansion for the last time. When her taxi arrived at Hawthorne Tower, a vicious swarm of reporters ambushed her flashing cameras and screaming insulting questions about her being a gold digger. Ella stopped walking, turning to face the blinding flashes with a spine made of steel. "I'm only ashamed of the people who actually believed my soul could be bought with a check," Ella announced to the crowd before marching into the building. The grand boardroom on the 40th floor was a vast, terrifying expanse of polished glass, cold steel, and 30 ruthless shareholders. Mr. Winters, the representative from the bank's custody office, sat quietly in the corner with a heavily sealed leather folder on his lap. Ella pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping into the lion's den, with nothing but her black dress and the red string on her wrist. The entire room fell dead silent as she marched to the center table, presenting her documents to the board. "I am Ella Moore, temporary emergency proxy for Adrian Hawthorne's shares," Ella announced, her voice echoing clearly in the massive room. The company's lead attorney stood up to object, his voice dripping with corporate condescension, claiming she had absolutely no legal standing in the meeting. Before he could finish his sentence, Thompson pushed through the side doors, slamming the original notarized proxy document onto the table and stating firmly that she did. Taking total control of the room, Ella formally requested an independent audit of the finances and the immediate suspension of Lucas's voting rights, demanding the secretary type her exact words into the minutes. Lucas slammed his hands onto the table, his face turning purple with rage, as he screamed that the proxy was invalid because the principal was dead. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room suddenly clicked open, cutting through Lucas's screaming like a knife. Adrian Hawthorne stepped into the boardroom, his dark coat sweeping behind him as he softly announced that he would resolve the confusion himself. A collective, breathless gasp sucked the air out of the massive room, as Vivian's chair screeched violently backward. But Lucas did not back down, letting out a loud, mocking laugh, and shouting that this man was nothing but a cheap actor hired by Margaret and Ella to pull off a desperate, fraudulent coup. The shareholders began to whisper in panic, looking at each other, as Lucas furiously ordered his private security guards to lock the room and throw Thompson and the actor out of the building. Before the guards could take a single step, Mr. Winters of Winters Bank stood up from his seat, his voice quiet, but carrying the immense weight of the financial world. "If there is any physical coercion or security interference in this boardroom. Winters Bank will immediately freeze the corporation's primary operating accounts within 5 minutes. Mr. Winters stated calmly, looking directly at Lucas.
The terrifying financial threat left Lucas completely frozen, his jaw clenching in absolute helpless fury as he was forced to stand down. Thompson then stepped forward, accompanied by an independent federal forensic examiner who placed a biometric scanning device onto the glass table. The examiner placed Adrian's hand onto the scanner, a bright blue light washing over his fingertips as the machine beeped. The massive screen behind them flashed green, displaying a flawless match of Adrian's fingerprints and iris patterns from the federal database. With his identity confirmed beyond any doubt, Thompson triggered the projector displaying the bank records, which proved Winters Bank had never released Adrian's voting block to Lucas. The second slide illuminated the horrific truth, a side-by-side comparison of forged dental records and a fake crash report. I saw that same signature on the fake crash report at the hospital. It was wrong even then, Ella stated, pointing at the slanted, erratic signature of Officer Doyle on the screen. The final slide displayed the undeniable money trail, showing millions of dollars moving from Hawthorne accounts into Lucas's private shell companies, which had purchased the exact faulty brake components that caused Adrian's crash.
The suffocating silence in the boardroom was broken by the sound of Vivian's diamond ring tapping nervously against the glass table. Realizing Lucas had lost his absolute power and could no longer protect her from prison, she made a desperate, agonizing choice. I handled the fake identification paperwork for the dead body, but Lucas was the one who handled the money, Vivian confessed publicly, throwing Lucas entirely under the bus to save herself.
Lucas lunged forward, screaming that the entire presentation was a theatrical setup, but Clara Bennett stood up from the back row, her hands shaking violently as she held up her glowing phone.
Lucas sent me this message to threaten me into silence, Clara revealed, clearly presenting the screenshot of Lucas's threat to the board.
Director Chen slammed her wooden gavel down the sharp, authoritative crack, echoing like a gunshot through the chaotic room, as she called for an immediate emergency vote to strip Lucas of all authority. One by one, hands went up across the massive table, until even Lucas's most loyal supporters completely abandoned him. Marcus stepped forward, grabbing Lucas by the shoulders and easily pinning his arms behind his back, as corporate security moved in to escort him out.
You think this makes you one of them, Ella?
Lucas spat bitterly as he was dragged toward the exit.
No, it means you do not get to use me anymore, Mr. Hawthorne,
Ella replied, her calm voice sealing his defeat. As the heavy doors closed behind Lucas, Margaret Hawthorne walked slowly into the boardroom, her silver cane tapping quietly against the floor. She officially stated that Oliver Moore's medical sponsorship was a debt owed to Ella, not a gift, admitting publicly that she had ruthlessly used Ella's desperation to protect her family. The very next morning, the grand, oppressive chapel at the Hawthorne estate was completely empty and silent. Margaret stood alone in front of the altar, ordering the maids to tear Adrian's portrait down. "Take it down. No more fake rituals in this house," Margaret ordered, her voice filled with a heavy, exhausted sigh, as the frame was removed. At St. Mark Hospital, the chaotic nightmare had finally come to an end. The television in Oliver's room played breaking news footage of Officer Doyle and Lucas Hawthorne being escorted in handcuffs by federal agents. Ella sat beside her brother's bed, looking exhausted but deeply, profoundly at peace, as the lead surgeon handed her the final consent forms for Oliver's fully funded life-saving surgery. She did not rush reading every single line with meticulous care before proudly signing her own name at the bottom of the page. On a bright Saturday morning, the tiny flower shop on the ground floor of the hospital opened its doors. Ella stood behind the worn counter, wearing her simple, faded apron, as she expertly trimmed the stems of fresh, vibrant yellow flowers.
The small brass bell above the door chimed softly, and Adrian stepped inside, wearing a simple dark coat instead of a billionaire's suit. He stood quietly by the door, patiently letting a nurse buy a bouquet first, respecting Ella's space and her livelihood.
When the shop was finally empty, Adrian walked up to the counter and gently placed the frayed white ribbon onto the wood. "I am not asking for anything, Ella. I am only returning the piece of you that saved my life," Adrian stated softly, his eyes filled with deep respect. Ella looked at him, acknowledging the pain he had caused, but also recognizing the respect he was finally showing her. "You used me too, Adrian," Ella reminded him, her voice calm but firm. Adrian nodded quietly, accepting her words without defense. "I know. I will wait outside," Adrian replied, before stepping out to wait patiently under the bright hospital lights. Ella picked up the ribbon and placed it in her drawer right next to her gardening shears, her cheap red string on her wrist glowing in the sunlight. She picked up her shears and continued to arrange her flowers. A woman who had fought the devil and refused to kneel.